I moved into apartment 42B on a Tuesday in October. The building was one of those pre-war brownstones in Brooklyn, the kind with creaky floors and radiators that clanged at odd hours. I didn't pay much attention to my neighbors at first. I was too busy unpacking boxes and trying to figure out why my internet wasn't working. But then I met her. It was a Friday evening when I first saw her in the hallway. She was struggling with grocery bags, her keys dangling from her mouth as she tried to unlock her door. I offered to help, and she smiled, removing the keys to say thank you. Her apartment was directly across from mine, 42A. Her name was Sarah. Sarah lived alone, she told me. She'd moved to the city 3 years ago for work, something in graphic design. She had that kind of energy that made you feel instantly comfortable, like you'd known each other for years instead of minutes. We talked for maybe 10 minutes in that hallway, and when we finally said goodbye, I found myself hoping I'd run into her again. I did, of course. In a building that small, you can't really avoid your neighbors. We'd cross paths at the mailboxes, in the stairwell, or at the bodega on the corner. Each time, our conversations got a little longer. She'd tell me about her day, about the difficult client she was dealing with, or the new coffee shop she'd discovered. I'd share stories about my job at the publishing house, about the manuscripts I was editing, the authors I was working with. There was something peaceful about those conversations. No pretense, no agenda. Just two people who happened to live across the hall from each other, making small talk that somehow never felt small. Winter came early that year. By November, the temperature had already dropped below freezing, and the building's ancient heating system struggled to keep up. I started hearing sounds from Sarah's apartment in the evenings. Music, mostly. Jazz, classical, sometimes indie folk. The walls were thin enough that I could hear the melodies but not so thin that it was intrusive. It became a comforting soundtrack to my evenings. One night in December, I was coming home late from a work dinner when I noticed her door was slightly ajar. The light was on inside, and I could hear movement. I knocked gently, calling out her name. When she appeared at the door, she looked exhausted, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, paint stains on her hands. She'd been working on a personal project, she explained. A series of illustrations she'd been putting off for months. Something about seeing them on her door made her invite me in, and for the first time, I stepped into her world. Her apartment was nothing like mine. Where I had bland furniture and half-empty bookshelves, she had personality bursting from every corner. Plants hung from the ceiling, artwork covered the walls, vintage rugs overlapped on the floor. There was a record player in the corner, surrounded by stacks of vinyl. The kitchen table was covered in sketches and paint tubes and coffee mugs. We sat on her worn velvet couch, drinking tea she'd made from some herbal blend she swore by, and she showed me her illustrations. They were beautiful, whimsical scenes of cities and nature intertwined, buildings growing like trees, subway trains swimming through underground rivers. Each one told a story. I told her they were extraordinary, and I meant it. She blushed, saying she never showed her personal work to anyone. It felt like a privilege, being let into this private part of her life. That night opened something between us. We started spending more time together. She'd knock on my door when she needed a break from work, and I'd do the same. We'd share meals, nothing fancy, just pasta or takeout from the Thai place down the street. We'd watch movies on her laptop, arguing good-naturedly about whether the ending of Inception made sense or if Eternal Sunshine was too depressing to watch on a weeknight. She told me about her family back in Oregon, how they didn't quite understand why she'd moved so far away. I told her about my parents, about growing up in Connecticut, about the expectations I'd spent my 20s trying to escape. We talked about loneliness in the city, about how you could be surrounded by millions of people and still feel completely alone. But when I was with Sarah, I never felt alone. January brought a blizzard that shut down the city for 3 days. The power went out in our building on the second day, and we huddled in her apartment because it somehow stayed warmer than mine. We lit candles, wrapped ourselves in blankets, and played cards by candlelight. She taught me how to play gin rummy, and I taught her cribbage, a game my grandfather had taught me as a kid. During those 3 days, I realized something had shifted. The way she laughed at my terrible jokes, the way she'd absently touch my arm when she was making a point, the way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. And the way my heart would speed up every time I heard her key in her lock, knowing she was home. When the power came back on and the city dug itself out from the snow, we went back to our separate apartments. But something had changed. The space between our doors felt both impossibly small and frustratingly large. I started writing her notes. Nothing dramatic, just little observations or jokes, slipped under her door when I left for work in the morning. She started leaving them for me too. We built this strange, wonderful ritual of paper conversations that continued even as we saw each other in person. February arrived, and with it, Valentine's Day. I'd never cared much about the holiday before, but this year felt different. I wanted to do something, to say something, but I didn't know how. We'd built this friendship that meant everything to me, and I was terrified of ruining it. On Valentine's evening, I heard a knock on my door. When I opened it, Sarah stood there in her paint-stained jeans and an oversized sweater, holding a small canvas. She looked nervous, biting her lower lip the way she did when she was unsure about something. The painting was of our building, but reimagined in her whimsical style. The brownstone had grown roots that became subway lines, and windows glowed like lanterns in the dusk. In 2 of the windows, directly across from each other, she'd painted 2 silhouettes. Just shadows, really, but I knew it was us. She'd titled it, 42A and 42B. I looked at her, at this incredible person who'd somehow become the center of my world, and I finally found the courage to tell her what I'd been feeling for months. That somewhere between the grocery bags and the blizzard and the notes under the door, I'd fallen completely in love with her. She smiled, that same smile from the first day in the hallway, and told me she'd been waiting for me to say that. Because she'd felt it too, probably since that very first conversation, when I'd held her grocery bags and she'd realized that maybe living alone didn't have to mean being lonely. We didn't move in together right away. We kept our separate apartments, our separate spaces. But the doors stayed unlocked now, and the distance between 42A and 42B became just a few steps across a hallway. A space we crossed dozens of times a day, carrying coffee or books or just ourselves, building a life that existed in the in-between. Sometimes the best love stories aren't about grand gestures or dramatic moments. Sometimes they're about two people who happen to live across the hall from each other, who take the time to actually see each other, to listen, to care. Sometimes they're about turning loneliness into connection, one conversation at a time. And sometimes, the person you've been looking for has been right there all along, just on the other side of a door you finally had the courage to knock on.